Aliens laughed when they saw the pitchforks, the rusted tractors, and the calloused hands. They demanded absolute surrender from a man they assumed was nothing but dirt and fragile bone. They didn't know this quiet widower wasn't just cultivating wheat. He was guarding a slumbering leviathan of physics, a doomsday lock forged at the very dawn of time. Sparks cascaded from the heavy welding torch, briefly illuminating the shadowed interior of the barn. Alistair Collins lowered his protective mask, inspecting the newly fused axle of his John Deere atmospheric harvester. It was an antique by colonial standards, retrofitted a dozen times to handle the dense, iron-rich soil of Oakhaven, a rim-world agricultural colony located in the Cygnus sector. Alistair wiped a grease-stained rag across his forehead, leaning back to admire his handiwork. He was a man composed of sharp angles and quiet endurance, his face weathered by 60 years of harsh sunlight and biting winds. To anyone looking at him, he was simply a farmer, a man whose entire universe consisted of crop yields, weather patterns, and the erratic fluctuating prices of grain on the interstellar market. "Dad," the proximity sensors on the North Ridge tripped again. Alistair turned to see his daughter, Aurora, standing in the barn doorway. She was 19, wearing a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt, a tablet clutched tightly in her hands. Her hair, a lighter shade of brown than his own, was tied back in a messy ponytail. "Probably just a herd of wild grazers," Alistair replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He tossed the rag onto a workbench, littered with wrenches and half-assembled drones. "The perimeter fences have been shorting out since the electrical storm last Tuesday." "It doesn't look like grazers," Aurora said, tapping the screen of her tablet. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "The telemetry is wrong. The mass displacement is massive. And it's not coming from the tree line, it's coming from above." Before Alistair could take a step toward her, the ambient light in the barn shifted abruptly. The warm, golden afternoon sun pouring through the skylights was snuffed out, replaced by a cold, artificial shadow that swept over the entire valley. Then came the sound, a low, oscillating hum that rattled the tools on Alistair's workbench and vibrated in his teeth. It was a sound that defied the natural acoustics of the world, a heavy, oppressive frequency that spoke of immense, hovering mass. Alistair walked past his daughter, gently pushing her behind him, and stepped out into the farmyard. Hanging in the sky above his hundreds of acres of genetically modified sorghum was a nightmare of obsidian metal. It was a warship, easily 3 miles long, shaped like a jagged spearhead. Its hull was devoid of markings, save for pulsing crimson energy conduits that ran along its spine. Smaller dropships were already detaching from its underbelly, plummeting toward the earth like iron rain. "Get in the cellar," Alistair said. His voice was entirely devoid of panic, presenting a terrifying calmness. "Dad, what is that?" Aurora whispered, her eyes wide with a terror that rooted her to the spot. "The colonial militia." "The militia's gone, Abby," Alistair stated, grabbing her shoulders and turning her toward the farmhouse. "If a ship that size made it past the orbital defense grid, it means there is no grid left. Go to the cellar. Lock the reinforced door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." As Aurora sprinted toward the house, Alistair turned to face the descending craft. He didn't run. He didn't search for a hunting rifle. He simply stood in the dust of his farmyard, watching as a heavily armored dropship flared its thrusters, scorching a perfect circle of his crops into black ash. The ship touched down with a seismic thud 50 yards from his barn. A loud hiss of depressurization pierced the air, and the heavy landing ramp lowered. Out marched a platoon of soldiers belonging to the Xylos hegemony. Alistair recognized them from the scattered, panicked news broadcasts that occasionally reached the rim worlds. They were a bipedal militaristic species, clad in thick, chitinous power armor. They stood over 7 feet tall, armed with directed energy rifles that could vaporize a man's torso in a microsecond. "Collins!" a voice shouted from the right. Alistair snapped his head to see his nearest neighbor, Gregory Harrison, running up the dirt road that connected their properties. Gregory was a stubborn man in his late 60s, clutching a double-barreled plasma shotgun. "Gregory, put that down!" Alistair shouted, breaking his stoic stance. "They're landing all over the valley, Artie!" Gregory yelled, chest heaving as he reached the farmyard. "I saw them blow up the communications tower in town! We have to hold them off!" "You can't hold off a hegemony strike force with a bird gun, Greg. Put it on the ground," Alistair pleaded, his eyes locked on the heavily armored aliens spreading out across his property. From the center of the alien formation, a figure emerged. He was slightly taller than the rest, his armor adorned with jagged golden emblems of rank. This was Commander Vrax. He carried no rifle, only a holstered sidearm, projecting an aura of absolute, contemptuous authority. Vrax pressed a module on his chest plate, and a mechanized translation matrix clicked online. Humans of this quadrant, Vrax's voice boomed, synthesized into harsh, heavily accented English. You are now property of the Xylos hegemony. Your lands, your resources, and your lives are forfeit to the expansion of the Empire. Cast down your primitive tools and submit for processing. Gregory raised his shotgun, his hands shaking but his jaw set. Get off our land, you overgrown insects! This is a sovereign colony! Gregory! No! Alistair lunged forward. It was too late. A sharp, searing crack echoed across the farm. A beam of superheated plasma erupted from the rifle of a Xylos soldier. It struck Gregory squarely in the chest. The older man was thrown backward like a rag doll, landing in the dirt, his shotgun clattering uselessly away. Alistair dropped to his knees beside his friend. The smell of ozone and charred flesh filled his nostrils. Gregory was gone, dead, before he hit the ground. Alistair stared at the smoking crater in his friend's chest, feeling the heat radiating from the wound. A predictable display of mammalian stupidity, Vrax sneered, stepping forward until his heavy metallic boots were mere inches from Alistair's kneeling form. You clutch your dirt and your pathetic weapons as if they mean something against the void. Look at you, a farmer in the dirt. Look at your primitive machines. You are nothing. Alistair slowly raised his head. He looked at Vrax, then at the soldiers pointing their weapons at him. He didn't show anger. He didn't show fear. Instead, Alistair's expression shifted into something hollow, something deeply, profoundly ancient. I am just a farmer, Alistair said softly. I grow things. I fix things. I like the quiet. Then you will die quietly in the mines, Vrax laughed, a harsh clicking sound. Secure the perimeter, sweep the structures. Scanners indicate an anomalous power signature beneath the primary agricultural building. Find it. Strip this mud ball to the core. Alistair lowered his head, resting his hands in the blood-soaked dirt. He took a deep breath, feeling the vibrations of the heavy boots marching past him toward the barn. They thought they had found a hidden generator. They thought they were dealing with an old man who didn't understand the universe. They were wrong. Before the Earth Exodus, before humanity scattered itself across the stars to escape the suffocating resource wars of their homeworld, there were men and women tasked with ensuring the species' survival by any means necessary. They were not politicians or soldiers. They were the architects of reality. Alistair Collins was not born on Oakhaven. Decades ago, he was Dr. Alistair Collins, former director of the Advanced Theoretical Physics Division at DARPA, and lead engineer at the Geneva Super Collider. When the colony ships were launched, the governments of Old Earth knew they would be vulnerable. They needed a deterrent, something that didn't require fleets of warships or massive standing armies. They built the Genesis Protocol. Only 3 men alive held the keys, and Alistair had chosen this quiet, backwater planet specifically because of its unique magnetic field, the perfect cradle for the burden he carried. "Commander!" a Xylos soldier barked, emerging from the barn. "We have located a subterranean vault. The structural composition is unknown. It deflects our deep penetration scans. It is drawing localized geological energy." Vrax's 4 eyes narrowed with greed. A hidden cache. Perhaps a planetary defense battery, or a stockpile of refined fissile materials. These humans scurry like rodents, hiding their treasures. "Bring the explosives. Crack it open." Alistair stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his jeans. 2 soldiers immediately aimed their rifles at his head. "I wouldn't do that," Alistair said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. The tremor of a frightened farmer was gone, replaced by the sharp, authoritative cadence of a man used to commanding rooms filled with the brightest minds in the galaxy. Vrax paused, turning slowly to regard Alistair. "You presume to give me advice, Dirt Scratcher?" "I presume to save your life, and the lives of everyone in a 10,000-mile radius," Alistair replied, stepping over Gregory's body. A soldier violently struck him in the back of the knees with the butt of a rifle, forcing him down again. Alistair grunted, but his eyes never left Vrax. "What you found under my barn isn't a battery. It isn't a treasure. It's a containment vessel. If you try to breach it with thermal explosives, you will compromise the magnetic field, stabilizing the core. And what exactly is in this core, human? Vrax mocked, walking over and grabbing Alistair by the hair, forcing his head back. A great weapon? A bomb to destroy my ship? My vessel's shields can withstand the fury of a dying star. Your shields are designed to deflect energy moving through space, Alistair said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. What's in that vault doesn't move through space. It is space. If you crack that shell, you won't trigger an explosion. You will trigger an unraveling. Vrax laughed again, a wet clicking sound that echoed in the quiet farmyard. He released Alan Ruler's hair and kicked him hard in the ribs. Alistair gasped, collapsing into the dirt, clutching his side. Pathetic, Vrax spat. You spin fairy tales to protect your meager horde. We have conquered 100 worlds, burned 1,000 cities. We have faced the zenith of technological warfare and emerged victorious. You are a biological curiosity clinging to a rock. Breaching team, proceed. Alistair struggled to his feet, tasting copper in his mouth. He looked toward the farmhouse. The cellar door was hidden from view. Aurora was safe, at least for the moment. But the moment was rapidly shrinking. He heard the heavy thud of grav charges being attached to the concrete floor inside his barn. He had spent 20 years trying to forget the mathematics of destruction. He had planted seeds, watched them grow, and focused on the simple, undeniable cycle of life. He had tried to wash the blood of the Earth Wars off his hands with the soil of Oakhaven. But the universe, it seemed, would not let him rest. Alistair reached down to his left wrist. He wore a heavy analog watch, a battered silver timepiece that looked like a family heirloom. He pressed the winding dial inward, twisting it 3 clicks to the right, then 2 to the left. The glass face of the watch dissolved, revealing a microscopic biometric scanner. "Hey!" a guard shouted, noticing Alistair's movement. He raised his rifle. Alistair pressed his thumb against the scanner. A tiny needle pierced his skin, sampling his DNA, cross-referencing it with his pulse rate and body temperature to ensure he wasn't under duress or dead. Identity confirmed. Collins, Alistair. Accessing Genesis lock. A holographic interface, no larger than a coin, projected from the watch face. It glowed with a pale, cold blue light. Inside the barn, a muffled explosion shook the ground. Dust billowed from the doors, followed by the triumphant shouts of the Xylos soldiers. "Commander!" the squad leader yelled over the comms. "We have breached the outer shell, revealing the interior." "It is." "Commander, I don't understand." "It's empty. It's just a sphere of black glass." "Bring it up," Vrax ordered, looking at Alistair with immense disappointment. "You bled for a sphere of glass, farmer. Your deception was as fragile as your bones." 4 heavy loader drones hovered out of the barn, carrying a massive cage of thick energy beams. Suspended within the cage was a sphere roughly the size of a tractor tire. It wasn't exactly black. Rather, it seemed to consume the light around it. It possessed no reflection, no texture. It was a visual void, a hole in reality itself. Alistair looked at the sphere, his heart pounding a heavy, sorrowful rhythm against his ribs. It was the 0-point singularity seed. It was a localized fragment of the primordial universe, a contained drop of the quark-gluon plasma that existed in the first microsecond of the Big Bang. It was raw, unbridled creation, held in stasis by a magnetic web so complex it required a planet's core to power it. "What is this trinket?" Vrax demanded, stepping closer to the sphere. The ambient temperature in the farmyard began to plummet. The soil around the drones frosted over in seconds. "I told you," Alistair said, his fingers dancing across the holographic coin on his wrist. "It's a lock, and you just picked it. But you don't know how to open the door." Vrax sneered, drawing his sidearm. "You exhaust my patience, human. I will kill you, and then my scientists will dissect this anomaly." Vrax aimed the weapon squarely at Alistair's forehead. "Do you know why we survived, Vrax?" Alistair asked, standing perfectly straight, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance as the sphere began to react to his watch's signal. "You aliens look at us and see soft skin and primitive tools. You rely on lasers, on plasma, on the manipulation of the current universe." Alistair pressed the final sequence on his watch. "But humanity?" Alistair smiled, a grim, terrifying expression. "Humanity reached back to the beginning. We don't fight with the universe as it is. We fight with the universe as it was. Command accepted. Tether release. The sphere shattered. There was no sound of breaking glass, no explosive shockwave. Instead, there was a profound, deafening silence, as if all acoustic vibration in the area had been instantly deleted. The heavy-loader drone suspending the sphere simply ceased to exist, not vaporized, but erased, converted instantaneously into a shower of subatomic particles that drifted away like glittering dust. Vrax stumbled backward, his four eyes widening in absolute horror as his sidearm grew red-hot, then white-hot, before melting over his armored gauntlet. He screamed, a high-pitched alien wail frantically trying to tear the melting metal from his hand. In the space where the sphere had been, a localized star had been born. But it wasn't a star made of burning gas. It was a maelstrom of violent, primordial colors, impossible hues of violet, gold, and blistering white that defied the optical spectrum. It was a tear in the fabric of local space-time, bleeding the raw energy of the early universe into the atmosphere of Oakhaven. Gravity went mad. The dirt of the farmyard slowly peeled upward, floating in jagged chunks toward the sky. The shattered remains of Alistair's tractor drifted into the air, slowly twisting as the molecular bonds holding the iron together began to weaken and fail. "What have you done?" Vrax screamed, dropping to his knees as the gravity fluctuations forced him down. The chitinous armor that had withstood orbital bombardments was beginning to crack, the high-density polymers turning brittle and flaking away like dry skin under the intense exotic radiation. Alistair remained standing. He was unharmed. The watch on his wrist was projecting a microscopic, localized Faraday cage of theoretical physics, anchoring him to the current reality while everything around him was exposed to the primordial fire. He walked slowly toward Vrax, the chaotic light of the singularity reflecting in his cold eyes. "You called me a farmer," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the silent roar of the cosmic anomaly. "You were right, but you fundamentally misunderstood the crop. The squad of Xylo soldiers that had emerged from the barn tried to fire their weapons. The moment the plasma bolts left the muzzles of their rifles, the energy was simply absorbed by the singularity, feeding it, causing the maelstrom to expand. The soldiers panicked, turning to run, but the erratic gravity seized them. They were lifted off their feet, thrashing in the air as their heavy armor was systematically dismantled by the shifting laws of physics around them. High above, the massive, 3-mile-long obsidian warship detected the catastrophic energy spike. Sirens wailed across the valley as the dreadnought desperately tried to reroute power to its thrusters to escape the gravity well forming on the surface. "Sensors are failing!" A panicked voice crackled over Vrax's surviving comms piece. "Commander, the atmospheric density is incalculable! It's pulling us down!" Alistair looked up at the monolithic ship, blocking out the sky. He raised his left arm, aiming the face of his watch toward the vessel. "You see, Commander," Alistair explained, his tone conversational, almost academic, despite the apocalypse raging around them. "When you harvest a field, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. You have to break the plant down to get what you need. That's what this is. It's a localized entropy accelerator. It's a thresher for reality." Alistair turned the dial on his watch one final click. The singularity surged. A beam of concentrated primordial force shot upward from the farmyard, striking the underbelly of the Xylos warship. It wasn't a laser cutting through metal. It was a localized restructuring of atomic bonds. Where the beam touched the ship, the impenetrable alien hull simply turned into a shower of base elements. Carbon, iron, oxygen, spilling out of the sky in a gentle, glittering snow. The massive dreadnought groaned, a terrible metallic shrieking that echoed across the planet. Its engines flared a brilliant, desperate crimson, and then died completely. The ship began to list, its structural integrity failing as the singularity stripped away its mass. Sections of the vessel sheared off, floating harmlessly into the sky as the localized gravity completely inverted. Vrax, stripped of his armor, shivering in his dark, scaled skin, looked up at his falling armada. His mind, conditioned for strategic warfare and technological supremacy, could not comprehend what he was witnessing. This wasn't war. This was unmaking. "Please," Vrax gasped, crawling toward Alistair, his arrogance entirely broken, replaced by the primal terror of a creature facing a god. "Stop it. We yield. We yield the quadrant." "You don't yield to a storm, Vrax," Alistair said softly, looking down at the broken commander. And you don't yield to a harvest, you just endure it, or you are consumed by it. Alistair looked toward the farmhouse. The cellar was shielded, buried deep within the bedrock, protected by the same magnetic baffles that had kept the seed dormant for decades. Aurora was safe. That was all that mattered. He looked back at the sky. The pride of the Xylos hegemony, the terror of 100 worlds, was disintegrating into a harmless, beautiful cloud of elemental dust over his sorghum fields. The invincibility of the alien empire had been shattered not by a fleet, but by a solitary man who had learned how to bottle the dawn of time. Alistair adjusted the dial on his wrist, slowly reining in the singularity, commanding the primordial fire back into its cage. The unraveling was complete. Now it was time to clean up his farm. Gravity normalized with a sickening lurch, dropping the suspended chunks of topsoil and shredded tractor parts back to the earth. The localized star that had unmade a hegemony dreadnought collapsed inward, folding into itself until it was nothing but a microscopic pinprick of light, and then, simply, nothing. The chaotic, blinding hues of the early universe vanished, replaced by the mundane, bruised purple of the Oakhaven twilight. Where a 3-mile-long obsidian warship had eclipsed the sun moments before, there was now only a glittering snowfall of base elements. Carbon, refined iron, and trace minerals drifted down upon the sorghum fields, coating the crops in a fine, shimmering dust. It was a macabre, beautiful fertilizer, born from the total molecular deconstruction of 10,000 alien soldiers and their invincible armada. Alistair Collins exhaled, a long, ragged breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He adjusted the sleeve of his flannel shirt, covering the heavy silver watch that still hummed with dormant, unfathomable power. At his feet, Commander Vrax was a broken, shivering mass of exposed biology. The terrifying Xylos conqueror, stripped of his chitinous power armor and his arrogant certainty, was weeping. It was a guttural, clicking sob that spoke of a mind utterly fractured by the incomprehensible. Vrax pressed his face into the dirt, terrified to look at the sky, terrified to look at the quiet man standing above him. "Get up," Alistair commanded, his voice devoid of malice, carrying only the weariness of a man who had done this too many times in his nightmares. Vrax flinched, curling into a tight fetal position. "Do not erase me," the alien commander babbled, his mechanized translation matrix glitching, producing a horrific blend of English pleas and alien clicks. "I am matter. Let me remain matter. Do not unmake me." Heavy, reinforced hinges groaned in the distance. Alistair turned his gaze toward the farmhouse. The steel cellar doors pushed open, and Aurora slowly emerged from the subterranean shelter. She stepped cautiously into the dying light, her tablet hanging limply at her side. Her eyes darted from the glittering metallic snow falling around her, to the melted slag of the dropship, and finally to her father standing over the weeping alien warlord. She walked forward, her boots crunching on the frozen, irradiated topsoil. She stopped 10 feet away, staring at the empty patch of sky where she knew a dreadnought had hovered only minutes before. "Dad!" Aurora whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away the tough, colonial exterior she had built up over the years. "Dad, the sensors, the telemetry, flatlined. The mass of the ship, it didn't jump to hyperspace. It didn't explode. It just ceased." "It was dismantled, Abby," Alistair said softly, his posture finally relaxing. He suddenly looked his age again, 60 years of hard living etched into the lines of his face, reduced to its fundamental building blocks. "It's harmless now. You." She looked at his wrist, remembering the strange, heavy watch he never took off, not even to sleep. "Who are you? What is under the barn?" Before Alistair could answer, the distant, rhythmic thumping of atmospheric rotors pierced the quiet. Over the eastern ridge, a squadron of colonial militia gunships crested the horizon. They were heavily armored, painted in the matte olive drab of the United Terran Defense Forces, rushing toward the distress beacon that Gregory Harrison had managed to trigger before his death. The gunships banked hard, their searchlights cutting through the settling elemental dust, illuminating the farmyard. When the pilots saw the melted dropship, the frozen ground, and the solitary, unarmored human standing over a captive hegemony commander, they hesitated. A sleek, black transport vessel descended rapidly, touching down just outside the perimeter fence. The ramp dropped before the landing struts had even fully settled. Out strode General Thomas Mitchell, a veteran of the Sirius campaigns, flanked by a dozen heavily armed shock troopers. Mitchell had expected to find a burning colony. He had expected to fight a desperate losing guerrilla war against the Xylos vanguard. Instead, he found a farmer and his daughter. "Secure the perimeter!" Mitchell ordered his men. Though his voice lacked its usual booming authority, he walked slowly toward Alistair, his boots crunching on the strange, metallic snow. Mitchell's eyes scanned the weeping wracks, the melted weaponry, and the terrifying absence of the warship his long-range scanners had detected. "Alistair Collins?" Mitchell asked, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. "Hello, Thomas," Alistair replied flatly. "You're late. The hegemony made landfall 40 minutes ago." Mitchell stopped, his brow furrowing. "My long-range telemetry logged a Class 9 dreadnought in your airspace. Where is it? Did they retreat?" Alistair gestured vaguely to the glittering dust settling on the fields. "They're fertilizing the north acreage, or at least their hull plating is." Mitchell stared at Alistair, then at the dust, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between military reality and the impossible scene before him. That's impossible. Nothing in the Terran arsenal can vaporize a class 9 without cracking the planet's crust. "It wasn't vaporized," Alistair corrected gently. "It was subjected to an localized entropy cascade, a controlled deployment of the Genesis protocol." The color drained entirely from General Mitchell's face. He took a step back, his hand falling away from his weapon as if the very air around Alistair had become toxic. Mitchell was high enough in the Terran High Command to have heard the ghost stories. They were rumors whispered in the darkest corridors of military intelligence. Tales of a doomsday deterrent developed during the Earth Exodus by a coalition of rogue physicists from DARPA and the revived CERN Fermilab Coalition. It was called the Oppenheimer-Hawking Directive, a weapon so fundamental, so deeply rooted in the primordial mathematics of the cosmos, that its use was considered a crime against reality itself. Mitchell breathed, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and primal terror. "You're the architect!" They said the project was dismantled. They said the theoretical models were buried. The models were buried, Alistair agreed, his gaze drifting toward the ruined barn where the singularity seed had slumbered. Buried right here, in the iron-dense bedrock of Oakhaven. "Along with me, Dad," Aurora interrupted, stepping between Alistair and the general. Her eyes were swimming with tears and confusion. "What is he talking about? You're an agricultural engineer. You design atmospheric harvesters." Alistair looked at his daughter, his heart aching with the heavy burden of truth. He reached out, gently placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. "I design machines, Abby. That much is true. But before we came to Oakhaven, I designed a machine meant to ensure that if humanity was pushed to the edge of extinction, we could push back with the weight of the universe." He looked down at Vrax, who was now babbling incoherently, his mind permanently shattered by his brief exposure to the raw, unbridled power of creation. "Take him," Alistair said, gesturing to the broken alien. "Interrogate him, if his mind still works. But make sure you send his scouting data back to the Hegemony High Command. Let them see the telemetry of what happened here. Let them know what they woke up." 3 standard galactic weeks later, the Xylos Hegemony High Command sat in absolute silence. In the grand obsidian hall of their capital world, the ruling council watched the holographic playback salvaged from the deep space telemetry buoys stationed on the edge of the Cygnus sector. They watched as their most advanced warship, the pride of their conquest fleet, was effortlessly unmade by a blinding, chaotic tear in reality. They analyzed the sensor data, watching physics rewrite themselves around a solitary, unarmored biped standing in a patch of dirt. There was no retaliatory strike ordered. There were no demands for vengeance. For the first time in their species' brutal, expansionist history, the Xylos hegemony felt the cold, paralyzing grip of existential dread. They realized that humanity was not a young, weak species clinging to scattered dirt balls. They were a species that had peered into the abyss of the Big Bang, scooped up a handful of the primordial fire, and put it in a glass jar. The hegemony immediately ordered all fleets to establish a 10-light-year exclusion zone around Terran colonial space. The invasion was over before it had truly begun. Back on Oakhaven, the morning sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long, golden shadows across the sorghum fields. Alistair Collins stood by the wreckage of his barn. A team of Terran military engineers had spent the last 3 weeks trying to reconstruct the containment vault, working under Alistair's strict supervision. They were terrified of him, treating him with the reverent caution usually reserved for an unexploded nuclear warhead. Aurora walked up beside him, handing him a steaming mug of black coffee. The military had cordoned off their property, turning the farm into a heavily fortified black site. But Alistair had insisted on continuing his harvest. He needed the routine. He needed the soil. General Mitchell says the hegemony signed the non-aggression pact this morning, Aurora said softly, wrapping her hands around her own mug to ward off the morning chill. They gave up the entire Cygnus sector. Unconditional withdrawal. Alistair took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon. Fear is a powerful motivator, Abby, but it's a dangerous foundation for peace. Eventually, someone will be brave enough, or foolish enough, to test the lock again. Aurora looked at the massive crater where the barn used to be, staring at the newly poured concrete of the subterranean vault. Dad, you said there were 3 keys. 3 locks. Where are the other 2? Alistair remained silent for a long time. The wind rustled through the surviving crops, a gentle, soothing sound that starkly contrasted the violent history hidden beneath their feet. I chose Oakhaven for a reason, Aurora, Alistair finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of a terrible secret. The Colonial Registry says this planet has a uniquely dense iron core, perfect for agriculture, but highly unstable for deep mining. That was a lie I coded into the surveyor drones 20 years ago. Aurora frowned, looking down at the dirt beneath her boots. What do you mean? Alistair turned to her, his gray eyes reflecting the dawn light. The singularity seed, the sphere you saw, it isn't the weapon. It's just the detonator. A matchstick. He crouched down, picking up a handful of the dark, rich soil, letting it sift through his calloused fingers. We didn't just bury the weapon on Oakhaven, Abby. We built Oakhaven around the weapon. This entire planet, its magnetic field, its tectonic plates, its core, it's all an artificial containment matrix. A macroscopic cradle. The other 2 keys aren't on other worlds. They're here. We are standing on a dormant, planet-sized entropy engine. Aurora's breath hitched in her throat. She looked out over the vast expanse of the valley, the rolling hills, the distant mountains. It wasn't just a colony. It was the barrel of a gun pointed at the universe, camouflaged as a quiet farming world. If the hegemony ever comes back, Alistair continued, standing up and brushing the dirt from his hands, if they bring their grand armada, or if the ancient empires from the galactic core decide humanity is too dangerous to live, we don't just unmake a ship. He looked at his wrist, where the heavy silver watch rested quietly against his pulse. We unmake the sector. We reset the clock to 0. Aurora stared at him, realizing the immense, crushing isolation her father must have felt all these years. He was a guardian of oblivion, condemned to live a simple life on top of a doomsday machine, praying he would never have to turn the final key. How do you sleep? She whispered, the enormity of the truth pressing down on her. Knowing what's beneath us? Knowing what you can do? Alistair offered a small, tired smile. He reached out and tapped the rim of her coffee mug. I sleep because I know that as long as I am here, the universe is safe from us, and we are safe from it. He turned away from the vault, walking toward the salvaged remains of his John Deere atmospheric harvester. It was battered, missing its rear axle, and coated in alien metallic dust, but the engine block was still sound. Come on! Alistair called back over his shoulder, his voice returning to the steady, rhythmic cadence of a farmer. The southern fields need to be tilled before the rains come, and we have a lot of scrap metal to plow under. Aurora watched him for a moment. He wasn't a god of destruction. He wasn't a warmonger or a conquering general. He was a man who had forged the ultimate sword, and then consciously chosen to use it as a plowshare. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs, and jogged after him. The galaxy was a dark, terrifying place, filled with empires that conquered and species that destroyed. They mocked humanity for being primitive, for clinging to the dirt and the quiet corners of the cosmos. But they didn't know the truth. Humanity didn't hide in the dirt because they were weak. They hid in the dirt to keep the universe from catching fire. And as long as men like Alistair Collins walked the fields of Oakhaven, the primordial dawn would remain locked away, slumbering peacefully beneath the harvest. If you enjoyed this journey to the edge of the cosmos and the shocking power hidden beneath a simple farmer's fields, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support the channel, share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and absolutely smash that subscribe button so you never miss another thrilling HFY adventure. Drop a comment below with what you think humanity's next ultimate weapon should be. See you in the stars.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, He's Just a Farmer, the Invaders mocked, then the human unlocked a weapon older than stars _HFY, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story carried a mix of quiet admiration and suspense. What stood out wasn't just the incredible power that was revealed, but the idea that true strength can be hidden behind the most ordinary life. It reminds me that judging someone by appearances can cause us to overlook wisdom, courage, and responsibility. Which moment stayed with you the most, and why? If you were in that situation, do you think you would have made the same choice to protect others, even at a great personal cost? Sometimes the best lesson we can take into everyday life is to stay humble, keep learning, and never underestimate people based on first impressions. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories like this one, feel free to like the video or subscribe for more.